Hi, I'm Eric, and I'm back with another video. It's 2 o'clock in the afternoon on August 26th, Wednesday, and the title of this article and presentation is called "Storm Clouds Gathering." The fathers have eaten sour grapes, and the children's teeth are set on edge. So I'll get right into it. Um, I'm starting off by saying I'm reading from this article, which is on Substack. You can read through it, and there's also some videos that are attached to it that I think you would find very useful. So, wise people are voicing louder and louder warnings. The main theme of my discussions and writing is my witnessing the ongoing and deepening crisis that we're in. I recently thought of it as a sort of a slow motion Pompeii, where you had this kind of wealthy, you might say, a suburb or wealthy city outside of Rome, and everybody was having quite a wonderful life there. Except that the problem was that there was a volcano nearby that was not cooperating, and eventually it did explode, burying thousands of people. Many of them died. Those who couldn't escape, obviously lost their lives, and it took several centuries for this catastrophe to be discovered. In any case, this post will be a kind of a further chronicle as seen through the eyes of two professors that I'm quite familiar with. Both of them are contemporaries of mine. They're in their 70s. Both happen to come from Jewish backgrounds, like mine also. Both are bitterly opposed to U.S. and Israeli policies, like mine. So first, Norman Finkelstein spoke with Jeremy Corbyn. Now, Norman Finkelstein, his two parents were Holocaust survivors. I think they both survived either the Warsaw Ghetto or Auschwitz or one of the brutal concentration camps of the Nazis, and they managed to get to America. And Norman is their child, and he has been a staunch defender of the Palestinians. He's been chronicling the genocide of the Palestinians for a long, long time. So I'm going to be reading a kind of a synopsis. This is an AI-generated synopsis of what they said. You can listen to the whole thing if you watch the video. So first of all, Jeremy Corbyn, and also he was a very important political figure in the UK. He was squashed, of course, by the people who actually run the UK. In any case, drawing on their experience in the anti-war movement and anti-apartheid movements of South Africa, they contrast those struggles with today's student-led pro-Palestinian activism. And Finkelstein notes that while previous movements were driven by a material stake, that is, that people of my generation, it wasn't merely our moral opposition to the Vietnam War. It was the fact that we were going to get forcibly conscripted to fight a war that we didn't believe in, and we knew that serious consequences, not just for the Vietnamese people, for ourselves physically. And the proof of that is in the levels of PTSD and all the problems that Vietnam era veterans have suffered. In any case, the current activism is fueled more by empathy among the young people who feel, quote unquote, pulverized by the same global capitalist system that oppressed Gaza. So in a sense, this is their opposition to what Israel is doing in Gaza is a reflection of the idea that they are Palestinians. They are also being crushed, albeit not as blatantly, but slowly and on a more subtle level. That moves on to the issue of the social and economic critique. So the second half of that video transitions into broader cultural critiques, including the decline of social mobility, the impact of student debt, and the vocationalization of higher education, where students are discouraged from studying humanities in favor of pure job-focused skills. So, when I was growing up, And as Norman Finkelstein pointed out, after you finished college, you got a job, and you actually had income security, and people could build families because they knew that they had an income. But it's not like that anymore, and so that's created a lot of uncertainty among many young people. The other issue is that technology and lifestyle, the negative impact of smartphones and digital culture on concentration spans. Let me repeat that. The negative impact on smartphones and digital culture on attention spans and critical reading, as well as the need for more pedestrian-friendly, cycle-focused urban environments. So the Finkelstein points out that he's been teaching for 40 years, and he says that the level of reading comprehension and the level of attention span of his students nowadays is much, much lower than it was when we were growing up. And I also see that in many young people. And of course, the other issue is that when I was, you could study English as a major, or in my case, I studied German literature. I got a background in what German thinking and philosophy was, which was very helpful for me in terms of giving me a sense of a worldview of what is actually going on in the world. And, why do we have these wars? Why did Germany go down its dark path? Why? And later on, I could ask questions about the role of Israel and the lobbies in the United States that allowed a country like Israel to even take place. And also, of course, the issue of vocation. Just the other day, I met a young woman, Chinese woman. She's studying here in Chiang Mai, Thailand, and she's studying in something like business applications in technology, something like that. And it's purely, quote unquote, skills to get a job. And she says when she gets out of college and she's working on her master's degree, she doesn't even know if she can get a job. I've talked with other Chinese people here, and they say the same thing. They're having difficulty finding jobs. So the whole economic system has shifted in a way that is not really so helpful to young people getting a start. And as a result, they're not marrying as much. They can't buy houses. So the whole system that we're in right now is deteriorating, and many young people really ask themselves if they have a future. When I was growing up, we didn't really think about that, except for the possibility of nuclear war. Now, the next person that I wanted to cite is Jeffrey Sachs. And Professor Jeffrey Sachs is speaking with Professor Glenn Deason and analyze how the West's pursuit of hegemony through military conflicts and economic warfare is driving an economic decline for the United States and Europe. So again, the key takeaways from that conversation. First, Sachs argues that the U.S. policy is driven by a delusional belief that it can dictate global trade and security. He criticizes current leaders, specifically mentioning Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, for treating international relations with a gangster mentality, quote unquote, that relies on economic coercion, forcing countries to do what the U.S. wants using economic warfare. He goes on to talk about Europe's strategic blunders. He highlights how European leaders have lost their autonomy, abandoning their own interests, such as economic integration with Russia and China, to follow a U.S.-led policy that is ultimately detrimental to their own economies. He describes this shift as incoherent and notes that many leaders now fear acting independently. I'll mention parenthetically that I have a German friend, and he's a digital nomad. He's living, I think, in Portugal right now, but he's going to have to go back to Germany. He says, Eric, have you seen Germany now? It's a mess. He says, crime is way up. The streets are dirty. There's a huge problem with immigration. And this is because the European leaders allowed the refugees of the countries that they destroyed into Europe. And now this is the consequence. Europe, when I went there, he asked me, when did I go there? I was there in 1969. Europe was a very cultivated, very nice place to be. Nowadays, it doesn't sound like that, at least in many of the major cities. Although I will say that I have friends who are currently in southern France, far away from the mess that's in Paris, and life still goes on there reasonably comfortably. But in any case, Sachs talks about the economic dead end. He talks about how the wars in Ukraine and the Middle East, along with trade protectionism, are causing immediate economic crises. Sachs points to rising energy prices and the fragmentation of global trade as a sign of systemic failure. So, by Trump thinking that he's going to bring Russia to heel with sanctions, and Biden thinking they're going to blow up the pipeline, Nord Stream pipeline, that's going to hurt Russia, ends up, it's not hurting Russia, it's actually hurting the United States as allies. But of course, what are the U.S.'s intentions? Maybe the reason why they blew up that pipeline is because they would rather have Europe pay 50% to 3 times more for U.S. energy, which isn't even so reliable, instead of relying on cheap Russian energy, which was fueling their quite successful economies. And so this is a whole, shooting themselves in the foot by not standing up to Trump's and the United States' unreasonable demands. The financial risks are a mega financial bubble in the U.S. driven by artificial valuations in artificial intelligence, and excessive debt, $40 trillion. And he warns that the U.S. is setting itself up for a major financial reversal, otherwise known as a crash, as the rest of the world increasingly seeks alternatives to the dollar, undermining the U.S.'s ability to project power. I just heard an item today that there's something like $75+ trillion that is not backed by hard assets. It's just backed by other derivatives of hard assets. So this makes for a very unstable financial environment. So now I'm going to go on here, and there are further symptoms of impending crash. So they give the kind of the theoretical background for what the problem is, but now I'm going to get into some specifics. So first of all, Ukraine is losing on the battlefield. People in the West were told for years Russia invaded unprovoked, which is an absolute lie. I know that for a fact because I was in areas that they're now under attack, actually. But I was in Sevastopol in 2015, and I met a family whose the guy's house and his mother's house had been bombed by the Kiev fanatics who were placed into power by the United States in a coup in 2014. So anybody who thinks that the U.S. That Russia invaded Ukraine unprovoked is completely false. Their plan has all along been to use Ukraine as a battering ram against Russia. Zbigniew Brzezinski was quite clear about that. In any case, Ukraine is losing on the battlefield. It keeps making strategic escalation, dominance, miscalculations. So they provoke Russia. Russia goes in to prevent a slaughter of people in eastern Ukraine. And first, Europe and the West say, "Oh, we're not going to give any lethal arms to Ukraine." Then they start giving shoulder-fired missiles, and then they start giving tanks. Then they start giving airplanes, and Russia has matched them every time. It's like a poker game where each side is raising the ante. but meanwhile, Ukraine has lost, at least 20% of its territory. Half its population is gone. And now they're talking about, and most of most of its fanatic Russophobic fighters, soldiers are dead or they're maimed for life. And it's reached the point where there's an active discussion to forcibly draft women to fight on the front lines and lower the draft age to 18. So this is my comment to this, is that Ukraine is a disposable item. Its main resource, people, is running out. Literally, millions have run rather than be cannon fodder or face economic ruin. Its most fanatical troops are either dead or maimed for life, yet the West demands more blood for money. We supply the money, the materials, and you supply the bodies. That's the West's strategy in Ukraine. The cynicism is just unbelievable. But the problem is that the bodies still in Ukraine are not willing to fulfill Lindsey Graham's dream to fight the Russians to the last Ukrainian. And it's quite possible that social collapse may precede military collapse. As the stores run out of goods, the latest miscalculation was when the Ukraine and the British and other countries decided to attack Russian shipping. And so Russia said, fine, if you want to, you're worried about disrupting our shipping, we're just going to bomb Odessa and the ports on the Black Sea, and you're not going to have any chance to ship any of your stuff. So now the shelves in Ukraine are becoming empty, and so this is all a result of this constant going back and forth, where the West thinks that it can out escalate Russia, and it's not working. So the next thing that we see is that Trump and his capo Secretary of the Treasury, Bessent, make economic threats which fall flat. So the Trump administration with the Israelis thought that they could take down Iran, break and get control of its government, install a puppet, and break it up and get control of its resources. That has failed. And so, but they can't admit to failure. So the Secretary of the Treasury, or shall we call him the Secretary of Economic Warfare, Bessent, demands that all nations stop trading with Iran under threat of tariffs and other measures. He spoke of it as a request. He said, we request that countries don't trade with Iran. And what he means is, we request that you stop. It's like the local mafia saying, we request that you stop buying from your local grocery store or we'll cut your legs off. This is gangster language, but he messed up in two ways. First, he didn't count on China summarily refusing to bend to his will. And even the UAE, United Arab Emirates, which is no friend of Iran, has been threatened by Iran. They say, look, you were hosting military bases, we bombed those, and you complain when you were allowing the U.S. to use your territory to attack our country. Well, sorry, you have to pay the consequences. And now they're saying to the UAE, if you follow through on the sanctions that Secretary Bessent is recommending, we will consider that as economic warfare, and we will destroy your economy. You want to destroy our economy? We'll destroy your economy. So, and as I say, the UAE has already been reeling from its complicity in U.S. attacks earlier. Now, the second thing is that Bessent threatens the world to cut nations off from the U.S. dollar. However, the majority of countries are sick and tired of using the U.S. dollar as a weapon and are looking for a way out. We're hearing reports of massive selling of U.S. bonds and unwillingness to buy more U.S. debt that is financing our whole, $40 trillion debt pyramid, not to mention what I hear will be a $2 trillion interest bill on that debt within a couple of years. We're already paying, I think, $1 trillion in interest. This is money that doesn't go into the productive economy, and then you wonder why kids can't get jobs and things are so messed up and they can't afford housing and so on. It's all because of the money of this system that we're operating under. So the majority of countries are sick and tired of using the US dollar as a weapon and are looking for a way out. So they're saying, hey, USA, if you leave, take your dollars with you and don't slam the door behind you. We won't miss you when you're gone. That's what BRICS is all about. So America's cultural narcissism is backfiring. Following World War II, with most of the world devastated by war, the US and the US dollar were the only game in town. So sanctions and dollar gangsterism, as described by John Perkins in his Confessions of an Economic Hitman, worked in the past. And I have a video of him talking about what the US strategy was for dealing with countries to get them to do what we wanted them to do. They go and they say, hey, why don't you take out some loans from the International Monetary Fund? And by the way, if you don't do that, we'll put sanctions on your country. And if you don't like that, we'll invade. That's essentially that's what Perkins called Confessions of an Economic Hitman, because he was engaging in economic war just as Bessent is doing now. But increasingly, countries are stronger and they create mutual support to resist US threats and attacks. And instead, the US is, as I have predicted for years, isolating itself. Most of the world is sick and tired of the USA. Trump and his vassals are not welcomed. And the final item is that the CIA's John Ratliff took a military transport plane to Moscow for reasons still unknown and only speculated about. He left after a few hours. The Russians probably offered him a free lunch and sent him on his way, reminding him that the US still owes Russia for the $300 billion that it froze, along with the Russian diplomatic properties that it stole inside the United States. We talk about private property, yet the United States actually took over Russian real estate in the United States. So I can only speculate on the results of that trip, but I doubt that Ratliff got a very warm welcome. So the conclusion here is that Finkelstein and Sachs both lay the contextual background for current events. The US is heading for strategic defeat and humiliation in both Ukraine and Iran. All this has created a huge problem for President Trump, whose popularity is in the dumps. He's hovering. There's an article here from USA Today saying that his approval rating is hovering near record lows. It's in the 30s. Yet the American people elected him, including many quote-unquote experts who now agree that they were fooled by Trump's promises. However, before that, Biden, who fomented the Ukraine war and supported genocide in Palestine, and who clearly had visible symptoms of cognitive decline, he had also been elected. And before that, Trump was elected, who ditched the nuclear deal with Iran, laying the groundwork for the current war, and built up Ukraine for the current war that is going on now. He was elected. And Obama was elected on hope and change. He protected Wall Street instead of protecting Main Street. He crushed Occupy, staged the coup in Ukraine, and illegally bombed 7 countries at least. So my question here is, why do we keep electing these people? And here is one possible answer, and I hope you're sitting down. There cannot be, under capitalism, genuine participation of the exploited masses in governing the country. It cannot be, if only because under the most democratic order under capitalism, the government is placed not by the people, but by the Rothschilds and the Steins and the Rockefellers and the Morgans. Democracy under capitalism is capitalist democracy, the democracy of the exploiting minority, resting on the restriction of the rights of the exploited majority and directed against that majority. Question: who said that? Joseph Stalin. Ouch. How dare he? That's why the capitalists hate him. He called them out in their crap. So that's it for me on this video. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you'll support my channel by buying a information billboard t-shirt like this. The beginning of wisdom is to call things by their true names. This is a famous quote from the Chinese philosopher Confucius. It was just as true 2,500 years ago as it is today. And you can also make a donation to my channel on Substack, or you can make a donation through PayPal. There's different ways that you can support me. So I hope that this has been both interesting and entertaining, and I will see you in the next video. Thank you very much.